Welcome to this special Indigenous Voices edition of the Salt and Light Hour. I'm Deacon Pedro. As we walk together towards healing and reconciliation, a few months ago we started Indigenous Voices, a little series within the Salt and Light Hour to help us get to know Indigenous people and to learn about their culture, languages, and spirituality, and also to understand the issues. So far, we've met Harvey McHugh, an accomplished educator from the Georgina Island First Nation in Ontario, Cassidy Caron, the president of the Métis National Council, Julia Kozak, an artist and dancer from the Nisga'a Nation in British Columbia, and Alan Jameson, an elder with the Cayuga Nation in Ontario. Today, we will meet a young woman, Thamer Linklater, who is really struggling with what it means to be Indigenous and Catholic. And also, we will hear from Earl Dionne, a wood-burning artist from the Mohawk Nation who has no problem integrating his Indigenous identity with his Catholic faith. Welcome to our third episode of this Salt and Light Hour special series, Indigenous Voices. Thamer Linklater grew up in foster care in Winnipeg. She later found out that what she always believed about who she was not all true.
So I'm Thamer Linklater. I was raised in Winnipeg, Manitoba, but my birth family comes from SLHour Cree Nation, and the English name is Nelson House, and it's like an hour north of Thompson in Manitoba. And the reason I say this is because I was raised in foster care my whole life. So my brothers and I, there were 5 of us, so 4 boys and me. I'm the youngest and the only girl, so it's kind of nice. We were apprehended when I was around 9 months, and my oldest brother was 9 years, and I left when I was 23. I was told that I was adopted and that I was Métis, and they didn't, my foster parents didn't know who my birth father was. But I found out when I left that I wasn't adopted. I was still legally under child welfare's care. I just stayed in the same home. They didn't move me around like they did other kids. I'm not Métis and First Nations, and that I've known my birth father my whole life. I just didn't know he was my birth father.
Wow. I want to learn a little bit more about that, about your birth father. But can we back up a little bit? So you said that you were told you were Métis?
Yeah.
And when you were growing up, that you thought you were adopted, but it was foster care. Were you growing up? Were your brothers in the same home, or were they in different homes?
We were in the same home up until I was 10. I don't know how old they were, but foster or child welfare either put them in different homes, and they just never came back to the house, or they were kicked out for various reasons.
And were there any other children in that same home, or was it?
Yes. After my older brothers left, they did foster care. So every year the family dynamics were completely different because it'd be a new set of children plus us.
And so, sorry, the other children were also Indigenous?
Yes.
Okay. And what was it like growing up in that home? I mean, did it feel like home, or did you feel like you didn't belong there?
I never know how to answer this question because some parts of my childhood were nice, and it was I felt like I belonged there. But I always knew I was different, and I just didn't know how or why or anything. I knew there was something off, but I could never quite place my finger on it. And then I became the youngest as a kid, and then when I got to like about 15 to 20, I was like suddenly the oldest kid in the house, and I was taking care of all the younger ones. So it was very confusing, I would say. But let me say, my foster parents are super Catholic. They are very devout Catholics, and I was raised in the Catholic Church, and like it was like what kept me going.
Okay, yeah, and I do want to talk to you about that as well. But but before that, were you? I guess you were in regular public school. You said that you knew that you were different, but you knew you were Indigenous, didn't you?
I was told I was Métis. I had nobody like we never really talked about identity and culture. Like it just wasn't a thing. So like nobody ever sat me down and explained it, and I didn't go looking because in my brain I'm like, oh well, I'm part Indigenous. Okay, I don't really understand the significance. But my foster mom's British, and my foster dad's French Canadian, and they were both like devout Catholics. So I'm just like, I can just choose which identity I want to like use, and like that's okay because that's like my personal choice, and I did not know about the history or the significance or anything.
Right. And when you were in school, did you feel like you were just like one of the other kids, or were you singled out? Were there other Indigenous children in the same school?
I think there were like maybe one or two other Indigenous students. Um, but again, it was never talked about.
So it wasn't an issue. It wasn't an issue.
No.
Um, and so tell me about growing up Catholic. You said that that is what sort of kept you going.
Yes. So like at first it was just something I did because that's what people do, right? Like we were taken to church, we went to like um other events and things. Like I was good friends with like all the priests I had and like the parishes. And it was just something I did and I didn't really understand it. I was just like, okay, sure. And then I was university. University is when things changed for me. I joined the Catholic group at the university I went to, University of Winnipeg, and we started talking, like drilling down into like the beliefs and like how to connect to Creator or God and Jesus and like all the figures. And like I kind of just bounced from crisis to crisis growing up. And I found that like talking and praying and like going to church and adoration and confession were kind of like they helped me get things off my chest and helped me figure out like what was going on in my life and how I felt about it. And like the more I listened to Creator and the more I prayed and the more like work I put into my faith, the more important and um, the more it just like kept me stable as the one constant thing my entire life.
Yeah. And again, I want to think I want to go back to that. But you said something about knowing who your birth father was all your life, but you didn't know he was your birth father. So even though you were living in foster care in this family that you thought was your adopted family, you still had a relationship with. So how did you know who your birth father was? Tell us about that.
So his name got bounced around by my brothers and like my foster parents. Like they would just casually mention things. Um, and like I knew his name, and he's not somebody that like I want to get to know. But he was just like this figure that people refer to a lot when I was growing up. So like I was aware of him.
I see. So you knew of him the name, but you didn't actually know him.
Yeah.
And how about your birth mother?
Same thing. Like she came to visit us as much as she could. And I still don't know why I was apprehended or what happened. And like she tried really hard to get us back from what like I've been told since I started talking to her again. And then something happened between her and the foster parents. My brother said something that was like taken out of context or something. So she just kind of stopped being a presence. And like I was super little and she was around more frequently. So like I knew of her, but I didn't know her.
And you don't have contact with her now?
We do talk, just not as often. And like I don't have anything to talk to my birth family about. Like we just live such different lives.
Right. So let's go back to university. So you were struggling with different issues, but you really felt that this university, this Catholic group at university, was helping you. You're feeling comfortable in your Catholic faith, but at the same time, are you also learning a little bit about what it means to be Indigenous and Indigenous spirituality?
Yes. So it was third year university. I took a cultural studies course and a short fiction course. And in both classes, like Thomas King came up in short fiction. And like I absolutely love Thomas King's work. He's the reason that like I went into Indigenous studies for my master's, and he's the reason like I'm like where I am right now. And then like we talked about like I was introduced to colonialism and like the Indian Act and like sort of broad stroke history things. And then I was looking at my life and I'm like, wait a second. I was like, I was taken from my family. My foster parents are both French Canadian and British. So like they're colonizers and settlers. So that felt weird, and things just felt like I was starting to question like my history and like why I was with this family and who this family is. And I started talking to elders and like asking questions and reading books. And then that kind of just eventually led to like this breakdown with my foster family, and I had to leave for my own safety. That's like a whole other conversation. Um, and then yeah, I moved here to Toronto from Winnipeg, or Peterborough from Winnipeg, and like I read all the books I can, and I talk to people, and like I'm more aware. And like looking back, knowing what I do now, I'm like they almost successfully colonized me if I haven't left.
Tell us a little bit more about that, because so I imagine that you're learning about all these historical things that happened to indigenous, doing air quotes, indigenous people, and then you're reflecting at some point, maybe like kind of the penny dropped and you went, hey, this is my life. What's going through your head? What's going through your heart at that time?
So like I didn't really look at the Catholic side of the history. Like I knew it was a thing, but I just couldn't go there. I could not, because like it still is such like a key part of my life, right? So basically I came to this realization that I've been lied to my whole life by everybody I've come into contact with, like school, with social workers, my foster parents. And like it makes me really emotional just like thinking about it. It's like they took like child welfare took literally everything from me, my identity, my family, my spirituality, like I'm slowly like gaining these things back. But like all those like broad scale things that happen in Canada kind of happen super micro in my own life. And like my birth family will talk to me every now and then, and like I learned that I have great grandparents who went to residential schools. I have grandparents who went to residential schools. My parents were in day school, and now my generation and my nieces and my nephews are all in child welfare. So like I see the broad scale, and I see like the just like how it's affecting me and my family, and there are no words for the pain.
I can imagine you didn't go to residential school, but it sounds like what was happening in residential schools, or the purpose of a residential school, continued happening through the child welfare system in cases like yours. What have you found out since about what was happening to other Indigenous children, maybe in Manitoba at the same time?
Yeah, so I did my thesis, my master's thesis on child welfare in Canada, in Manitoba specifically. And I started reading about like Tina Fontaine, who was murdered while she was in foster care, and Phoenix Sinclair, he was in foster care and then given back to her parents, who then murdered her. And I started talking to other survivors, and like all the things, like I find common things like the abuse, and this one I found out last week is that a bunch of us were told that we were Métis, even though we aren't. So that's another common theme that's coming out of like what I'm reading and who I'm talking to. And then just like the disconnect from like our parents and our grandparents, and like they know all the history. So when they're talking, they'll just casually name drop or casually mention something. And then I'll be like, whoa, wait a second, like what? Like this is like awful. Example, when the children were found last year, one of my aunts on my Facebook page just casually mentioned in a comment, oh, your great uncles went to school and they never came home. And I found out over Facebook in the middle of everything going on. And then like my birth mom would call me, and like she's going through the scars and the trauma that happened at residential schools is the same thing happening now to my generation and my nieces and my nephews. It's the exact same scars. When I listen to residential school survivors, it's like we talk about like being disconnected and not having identity and just feeling lost and alone and confused. And like child welfare started with the schools. There were schools specifically founded for like child welfare reasons, for like protection or like poverty and abuse, and the schools closed, but they're still taking Indigenous children.
Yeah, and I guess some of our listeners maybe have heard the term the 60s scoop,
Yes.
but you did not grow up in the 60s, so obviously this was still happening 20 years
I
ago.
was in the 90s.
Yeah.
So it's called the Millennial Scoop now. And it's the same idea as the 60s Scoop. It's just a different generation. And there's like there's more legislation with the Millennial Scoop. It was just a practice in the 60s Scoop. It was a thing people did. It wasn't like a technical policy or document or act or whatever. But with the Millennial Scoop, it is. There's acts and like policies and laws and things around child welfare. And now, instead of mostly white people taking our children, it's Indigenous social workers doing that work.
Right. Yeah. So the policies switched from a federal policy to provincial policies. I think that has been made clear. Now, you mentioned the discovery last year of the unmarked graves in Kamloops, and how that brought up and stirred up a lot of emotion for you as you were learning. I don't know how much you already knew about the Catholic Church's involvement in the residential school system. But you have said that your Catholic faith is important for you, even still now. I know that you're struggling with it. Can you tell us a little bit about that struggle?
Yeah. So like specifically in Canada, I didn't know this. This is completely new information to me about 4 years ago. I found out that, oh yeah, no, they ran like a significant chunk of the residential schools, and like the Order of Nuns that runs my Catholic school, I'm like 80% think that they also ran a residential school. And I'm like, how can, like, why, like, this isn't creator's work. This isn't what he says in the Bible. This goes against everything that, like, he says in the Bible and what he teaches, and this is like completely contradictory to the church that I know and that kept me safe. Like they like just the horrors that people in the church did. It's kind of like I felt really angry, like just really angry that such awful things happen, and like kind of guilt and shame as well, like guilt for being part of an organization or an institution that did such awful things, and shame for like having it be such an important part of my life. Like it's still something I'm struggling with.
Did you feel like you couldn't even practice your Catholic faith?
Yeah, like I stopped praying, I stopped going to church, I stopped reading the Bible, I stopped talking to my Catholic friends, and then just like super ignorant comments from people being like, oh well, the residential schools were like a good thing, and like it was well meant, and like it wasn't all bad, and just completely disregarding how awful and how damaging they were, and how like just things like that, or just like comments people make, just how so many people I knew kind of subscribed to like racist thoughts and ideas and like believed in stereotypes. And I find myself often having to defend my existence in the church and defending like my ancestors and my story to people.
Right.
And it's exhausting.
At the same time, you told me though that you've also have had a lot of good support from priests and people in the church.
Yes. So I'm part of a group called CARE. It's Catholics Acknowledging Indigenous Reconciliation. CAIR. And I just like that it's CARE, because like that's such a nice, kind, like welcoming, loving word. And y'all really like it. So we meet about once a month, and there's this priest, Father John Purdue. He's been with me through a lot of things. He's come to visit me at like crisis centers, and like he sits and he listens, and he just like lets me be me. He lets me be angry and confused, and he so in CARE we share. It's for primarily Indigenous people who are Catholic, and we just talk about like what it's like to be Indigenous and Catholics, and the challenges that we face, and like it's a forum where we can be ourselves without being judged. And Father John's part of this, and like he doesn't always know what to do or say, and like but he doesn't like scold us or defend the church, or he just sits there and listens. And it's people like Father John, like that is reconciliation. That is the work that people need to be doing. It's not easy and it's uncomfortable, and like you're not always going to know what to do or say, but just sitting there listening and absorbing and reflecting is like important. And Father John is the only reason that I'm still like part of I still consider myself Catholic, and why I'm doing this interview. And yeah, like there are people who want to do the work. It's just hard finding them sometimes.
Yeah, hopefully through you participating in this interview, we'll be able to find more and more people. How do you feel about the delegation that went to Rome, and the words of the Holy Father, and the fact that the Holy Father might come to Canada?
Yes, I followed it really closely. I will admit I was a bit skeptical, just given like my history and just people's responses. But I will say it was real. Like I feel like from what I've heard, the Pope really did listen, and he did learn, and like it's a good step. It's a good symbolic step. And it was nice, and like it didn't take everything away, it didn't take the pain away, but Like, it was comforting to know that like our pain is being acknowledged. But it's a good step, and I have like cautiously optimistic.
I think that as in any work of reconciliation, it's hard work and it requires conversion, and that's also hard work. If you were to tell Canadians or maybe Canadian Catholics one thing that you think that they need to know so that we can begin this walking together on the path of healing and reconciliation, what would it be?
I was not prepared for that question. Um, it's gonna be hard work, and you're gonna be uncomfortable and like have all these emotions, and like it's messy work, but it's important work. And it doesn't necessarily have to be like the big grand gestures. It could also be like talking to an Indigenous person, befriending them, and like sitting with them as like they process things. It doesn't have to be this big, grand, complicated thing.
Yeah, thank you. I think that's so important. It's just listening to each other. Thamer, thank you. I'm glad you're doing better, and thank you for sharing with us a little bit about who you are today.
Thank you so much for providing this space.
Thamer made me think how complex these issues are and how deep the trauma caused by certain colonial practices can be. Many Indigenous people are Catholic, and it is possible to be Catholic and Indigenous at the same time. It is also possible to find comfort and support in the church, while at the same time struggle with certain things that members of the church did, or the role that the church may have officially played in a system that caused great harm to a group of people. At the same time, it is encouraging to know that education is a valuable tool to help all of us move through truth, to justice, into healing and reconciliation, and to remember that the work of reconciliation is hard work, and it doesn't necessarily have to be a grand gesture. Just sitting with each other, listening to each other, getting to know each other, that is where the real work of reconciliation happens. I'm Deacon Pedro, and you're listening to a special Indigenous Voices edition of the Salt and Light Hour. Listen to all our programs at slmedia.org/podcast. Earl Dionne belongs to the Wolf Clan of the Mohawk Nation in southern Ontario. He grew up in St. Regis, Ontario, and has great memories of the church growing up and a great devotion to St. Kateri Tekakwitha.
My family's from Akwesasne. That means in Mohawk, the land where the partridge drums. And my dad, he started ironwork in the Buffalo area. Had a few companies, so we always refer to I always known Akwesasne as like a little slow. We always say going up home. So because it's kind of like the northern part of New York State where it meets Quebec and Ontario.
Okay, so you grew up in New York State. Is where you were you born there?
No, I was born in Akwesasne, but my dad, about the age of 2, when he started working more steady, he moved my mom and myself down into Western New York area because I had another uncle that was also ironworking. So he just moved us to the Western New York area because that's where he was with a couple companies, and so I would just kind of visit back up in Akwesasne on summer vacations and everything.
And was it a big family? Did you grow up with uncles and aunties or?
Yeah, I had lots of aunties. My mom has 8 sisters and 1 brother. So and so I had quite a bit of family, up in Akwesasne or up home.
Yeah, and sorry, I was going to say for our listeners that maybe Akwesasne is the Cornwall area.
No, that's actually St. Regis Reserve, but the traditional
Right.
word they used to this is to call it Akwesasne.
Yes.
You know,
No.
there's
So, and was it in a reserve, the St. Regis Reserve, was your family in the reserve?
Yeah, that's where my grandparents grew up, right in St. Regis. My grandfather grew up on St. Regis Island, and that's right in the Thousand Islands there,
Right.
where the Ontario, Quebec, and New York State kind of come together. So there's a lot of boundaries and borders right in that area.
Right. Was it common for people in your community to sort of go back and forth between Canada and the US?
Oh yeah, my aunt, she's 90 years old, just finished a book. She just finished her book, memoirs of, because my mom and all the sisters and my grandmother and grandfather, they grew up a lot of them grew up for a while there at the International Hotel, which sat right on the boundary line.
Okay.
Half the hotel sat in Quebec and the other half sat in New York State. So that was quite different. They'd have Mounties coming in one door, and so if some of the people were drinking beers, they'd move to the other side of the room to be in the New York State side, and they wouldn't be asked any questions or harassed in any way. And then vice versa, you'd have the New York State troopers come in. So half the hotel was on one half of the border, and the other half was, in Canada. So, there was a marker right in front of the hotel. So yeah, it was very interesting. And
Interesting.
plus with growing up with the islands but my grandmother, Josephine Sawadas, she pretty much ran everything. And I think she was the influence of our family as far as the Catholicism. She pushed all, she made all her daughters and son take catechism classes.
Right.
And that's kind of, continued through my whole family. I've noticed that she was kind of the one that put all that in motion, and it's kind of filtered through down the generations. We see, I see influences of that, right through my entire life, even up till today.
Mm-hmm. Do you know what your grandmother was, her family Catholic as well? Do you know how many generations back, or how did she end up in the Catholic Church? Do you know?
I'm going to inquire more about that, but I do know that when Father Jacobs was up at the reserve, he was a big influence. His father was an iron worker from Ganawake. He was Mohawk, and he spoke the Mohawk language, and he taught a lot of the prayers and did mass, in the Mohawk. And so I know he was a big influence, like with our family. He probably performed a lot of the marriages at the St. Regis Church.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's like it goes back. I don't know who would have influenced Father Jacobs to want to become a priest, because I'm sure his mother might have had a hand in that, or maybe he, seeing other priests, maybe that influenced him. And he spent his entire priesthood, I think, working up at the St. Regis Reserve or Akwesasne. And
wow,
he was he had a very good influence for, and he would always kind of joke around and say that he has to answer to a bishop in New York State, and also a bishop in Ontario and a bishop in Quebec.
Right.
Because that was all his jurisdiction. So, because I've kind of looked back into these influences, because then my mom would be the next one to really, for me as an only child, to kind of, push the Catholic faith. And I've seen it with other aunties. I'd see prayer cards of Saint Catalina Gaguita pinned on the wall. And so, and then on down the line later on, I'd see more evidence of, we weren't the strongest church going Catholics, but that always seemed to, show itself even through some of my uncles and aunties.
Mm-hmm.
Some of them went to the Guadalupe conferences faithfully, and my uncle Dickie Francis joined the Knights of Columbus, and
wow.
So that kind of made me want to follow along, and also it was because of Guadalupe Gaguita. It was kind of everybody looked forward to it. It was like my Mohawk culture, although it was deeply rooted in nature, it was kind of guided by, she was like the sun that guided how, to keep everything kind of on course.
So you would say that for you, that your experience growing up, there was a good relationship between the Catholic Church and the Indigenous community?
I think so. I think like when, say, somebody would pass away, like an aunt or an uncle, maybe they'd have a mass said, and we'd always see which cousins were like present at the mass. So then it would surprise me who would show up, and some cousins are always there, some aunts are always there. But as things are getting older, I just pay attention to how, you know, but it has been, I think it's been a good influence because I've always had really good aunties and uncles that treated me like a second set of parents. I
Yeah.
can never say I've been treated cruelly from any of my aunts or uncles. I've never seen any wildness at any of the households, and my cousins have all been I couldn't ask for better cousins, and I think that's a direct correlation to the structure of following along in this,
Yeah, yeah.
with the church.
And you've told me in the past about Father Jacobs and what an influence he was for you and your friends growing up, your family growing up. And I guess just for our listeners, again, you've mentioned Gadali a few times, and in case they're not sure who that is, that's Saint Catary.
Yes.
But you use the Mohawk pronunciation, Gadali de Gaguitha. Did you grow up knowing about her? Was that a common sort of knowledge about this woman? She wouldn't have been a saint yet.
Yeah, she wasn't a saint. Well, I know she was beatified in, I think, 81 or in that
Right.
80, maybe
Yeah.
80. But I mean, her name, from the time I could even first talk, I think Gadali de Gaguita, saying her name, and as a young boy, it made me feel like I knew how to speak Mohawk because her name just flows nicely that way. And
Yeah.
so she was really impressed on me as a child, and my other cousins. We've always looked at her as kind of like a saint already, even though she wasn't officially canonized. She had that much of an influence, and I think, when I got my spinal cord injury, I think that's why I kind of gravitated towards her. It's funny, our household never had anything native in the house, like pictures or artwork. It's almost like when my father settled us in the Western New York area, we were trying to be almost like those families you'd see in a Sears catalog,
Right.
more like, and not so much with the native things. We have all the modern, trappings of the early 70s and late 60s. The only thing that was native in our house was a statuette of Saint Catalina Gaguita that sat on our fireplace.
Oh yeah. Do you think that the reason why there weren't any sort of indigenous images in the house was because nobody was thinking about that, or it's not like your family was trying to not be indigenous? Was there any of that going on?
I think only in the ways that for opportunity and to kind of
To blend in
better, and I just think at that time, and people, like even in the Catholic, when my father signed me up for Catholic school, and I was probably, I think, one of the only cousins that went to Catholic school, kindergarten through 8th grade. And at that time, like even in Catholic school, they weren't that wanting to know so much about my culture. It was kind of something that it wasn't really, I don't know, like it wasn't so much they were interested in it. Then later on, when I taught in the schools, I think the Catholic schools and universities are the ones that put the most funding and want to have everything very genuine, and they want to know the most about it. So it's really gone from one end of the spectrum all the way to the other one.
To the other, yeah.
Yeah.
And it's interesting because I think and you've told me this before, that it's more of the Catholic faith for you and your family was more of a cultural thing than it was almost as a practice. Right? That it was the ritual more so than the beliefs per se. Is that fair for me to say?
Yeah, like one time when I did my first craft show at Gadali Hall, I put out my wood burnings, and some of the wood burnings had images of Gadali, Saint Catary on there. And I remember this one native woman, she come up to my table and she pointed real hard with her finger, tapping loudly at the wood burning plaques, and she said, "That's not our way." She just mumbled that under her and gave me a real nasty look. And I kind of was taken aback. Like I think I might have even taken the plaques off the table, or because I didn't know. I'm trying to blend in with the St. Regis, with this craft show, and I was new at doing my art. later on, I just kind of somebody, saying that, like, that's not our way. But then later I just thought about it and I thought that is my family's way. It is our way, because all the funerals and weddings and baptisms, everything kind of came through St. Regis Church, and then like my Uncle Nelson, he was sick. He passed away since, but I've talked with him a few times. We have some heart-to-heart talks, and he would always tell me how when they sing the Lord's Prayer in Mohawk, how that was the most beautiful thing to him in the Mass. And when he went through his cancer, he was telling me to go see St. Joseph's in Montreal and St. Anne de Beaupré's at those churches, like to make a point of going up there to see it, because he was telling me about the crutches and everything there, and the canes hanging there on the wall. And so those kind of things I pay attention to, because when he was really had his back against the wall with his health, it was kind of like, again, it was the Catholic faith, or it was those things that gave him comfort. And I've always paid attention to that. I've always remembered that.
Yeah. You mentioned your wood burning, and I think that it's fair to say that that's your main medium for art, but you do other kinds of art. Did you always want to be an artist? How did you start finding interest in the arts?
Probably from my cousins. When I would be up in Akwesasne, we were my Aunt Dorothy's. We really didn't watch TV or anything. Like, we had to go pump water at the well, and there was no running, we had outhouses and everything. But there was a lot of drawing and a lot of activities, crafts. And my cousins were always really good. Like, even just doing coloring books, that their colored pages were so perfect. Like, and mine just never looked. I never thought I'd measure up. I always admired my cousin's art, and but as an only child, that was just a way that it was for entertainment for me to just draw all the time. Especially if my parents were visiting with other adults and I was bored, they would give me some, pencils or pens and blank paper, and that would just keep me busy, almost all the time. And then over time, you just kind of find you have a knack for it, and your skill level kind of gets better, the more you practice with things like that.
So when you finished high school, did you know that you wanted to go to university? How was that transition for you?
I think the only reason I graduated from high school, I think, was because of the art. And the art teacher really told me I should go to college and continue on in that field, arts, and that is what I ended up doing. In a roundabout way, I ended up going back, to that same college and taking all the different arts and also the art education courses.
Yeah, and you became an educator, not just for the art, but also to teach young people, particularly about a little bit about your culture and the indigenous traditions. Why do you feel that that's important?
I think it all stemmed from when I got my car accident and when I was in a hospital, and I think when things turned around, like I was when I was praying to Saint Gadali, I don't know. It's like in that moment, so many things flashed through, including my childhood in Akwesasne. It was like the simplest and happiest times of my life, and it just always stuck with me. I don't know. It's like everything blended together. It's like the nature, her influence, and then the healing influence of the art. Like I had to start using my opposite hand. And I use big foam grips, so that there was always that healing thread to it. And I've kept that always as a part of my programs. When I did start to teach in schools, I always, tied the healing together with the art, and also together with the native cultural things. Because I think playing with the wood and with the fire, it was very easy to kind of tie all those things together.
Tell us a little bit, when you go to schools now, how do you tie that in when you talk to the students and you're trying to get them, because you'll get them to do a little bit of art themselves, or to find the story that they want to tell. How do you explain to them the healing part?
Yeah, well, like when we did our truth and reconciliation classes, we did the Secret Path book, and we also had we did paddles because there was a longhouse thing called Turning of the Ashes, and so we'd use some of those themes, especially Turning of the Ashes. We'd always start our classes off with what we call like our sacred fire. We'd always get our chairs in a circle, and then we'd say there's this fire in the middle. Like it's like going back in time in your mind. It was our 400-year-old lodge, and we'd have that fire in the center, and so that we would, in the beginning we would always just introduce ourselves. We had a nice big turkey feather wrapped in leather. We passed that around. So we would, and then we'd start to ask, like, name, introduce, favorite animal. Then we'd ask, like, what's the hardest thing you've ever had to do? And that was just kind of to really get people to, I don't know, because when you have that feather in your hand and when you're all sitting with nothing between each other, just facing each other in that circle, sometimes that's when you get a lot of some of the difficult sharing, because it was, especially with the truth and reconciliation, it was important because everybody had some kind of struggle or things that was sad to them, or something that really would get them tied into what we were trying to do with our project. And that would be on the grade school level, high school level. Some of the things might be, it was very powerful. Like in the one high school class, this brother come out and said about, this boy, he was probably a senior in high school, and he come out and talked about his brother's suicide. And after our class was over, the teacher come up to us and just said, I want to thank you, because I've had that boy in my class for like 3 years, and I never even knew that had happened to him, that his brother committed suicide. So sometimes things like that will come out, and if there's tears, we've learned to bring water and tissues. And my Jackie, I think you've met Jackie in the past. She was facilitated with me in the classrooms, and she's Ojibwe, so she would collect the tissues and always tell them that these tears are valued, and that we'd collect them, and she'd return them into, like, say, the river, return them to the water. And we'd always say that they strengthened our fire, because if it was grade school, a lot of times a grandparent might have cancer or something, and that would be really, like, with grandparents, especially with grade school kids, was really something that was important to them. And so, and the sharing would just get different through the different grade levels. And anyway, that strengthened our fire. And then later, when we started to do the burning, we'd be using the fire in a more enjoyable way. Later, we put on some native relaxing flute music, and we burn on our projects, and that was the nicer part. So it was like a roller coaster. It was like, because they got, a lot of them, we had techniques and everything to get them to be to reach down deep. We call it feeding our fire good wood, because there's like that green wood that's smoky, and that's not a good wood to put in and that's the kids that just didn't want to, that they would just shrug their shoulders or try to just mimic or try to maybe get a laugh. And we wouldn't want any of that kind of wood. It was the ones that really were courageous and spoke about something that wasn't always easy. Maybe the first time that they brought this up, and that was a very healing thing. And we'd protect that fire. We'd protect everybody who shared that way.
Yeah.
Earl, and I think that all came from the Gutta-Lee thing. I think that, like I said, she kind of guided everything, including me going back to school to be an art teacher.
Earl, there's maybe not so much now, but a year ago, I can think there was a lot of anger among Indigenous people, particularly towards the Catholic Church. There were people burning churches down and or vandalizing churches. What would you say to some of those people that are, in some cases, rightfully angry? What would you say to them?
Well, I was thinking of this because, I knew we were going to be having this talk, and I thought about our truth and reconciliation, because there's so many things I've learned from. I think as a good teacher, you should learn. Your classrooms are like a microcosm of like the entire society, and these kids are going to be growing up and running our world. And I just find it can be harmful to cloak human suffering in anything that's exclusive, in exclusivity, like cultural things. Like in the one school, some things they would do that was recommended was to take children to the residential school. They used to call it the mush hole in Brantford. And we'd find that the kids would be in tears from the stories they would hear.
Mm-hmm.
And they weren't just ready for that kind of like to revisit such like the horrible things. It was kind of like almost too much for the students. And in the one case, they had an altercation. One boy, made a little joke or made fun or laughter or something, and they got hitting each other. One students were striking each other, and the teacher told us about this. It was concern, and so we addressed that the next time we had them in our circles. We talked about about how that wasn't right. But that's the kind of things when you have sadness and anger and that vulnerability to, I don't think to dwell in those tragedies. You got to be very careful because you open people up, and sometimes when they're just a mixed group, like a field trip,
Mm-hmm.
I don't know, I just find, I think it's different when, like I mentioned, our circles where there was tears and some deep sharing and everything. I think it's different when you share together. I think everybody has a story and has something that they want to speak on, and I think to allow each other to have voice.
Mm-hmm.
and to share it in a sadness rather than it's like when I used to do my native art, I always would visit at the Six Nations. I would always want to get the genuine glass beads and good deerskin leather. I'd want everything to be so authentic, like real feathers, if my pieces had any feathers on them. And I would use I would have the stories that my art told to be real things from our culture. So it's like you're trying to make everything really genuine. But when people are trying to feel a sadness or trying to join in with this truth and reconciliation, I think you have to allow them. You can't just be like, well, this is our sadness, not yours.
Mm-hmm.
Or you can't be a culture cop. I think that's really something that can happen really easy. And I think it's better to just, to let everybody to just, share in it in their own way. I think that's and not to take ownership of those things.
And that's difficult work, and it's a work that takes a long time. What do you think that the Catholic Church in this country, in Canada, has to do or should do that would be a clear sign of reconciliation?
I don't know. I think I see it happening, even today. Like, it's just a different world we live in. And I think if it's just gonna take time. I think in God's time. Like, I think because it's such a new world, I pay attention to things. I think they're out there. It's like the hidden seeds of faith are still being sown, like in St. Regis or Akwesasne. Like when I listen to like CKON, the radio station up there, I stream it here because me and my mom listen to it every morning. And sometimes when they do the obituaries, I'll hear like this, maybe a man or a woman, and they have gotten married at St. Regis Church, and they have such a big family with a lot of grandkids, and the activities that they did in their life, volunteering, maybe one of them maybe coached lacrosse or a ball club, and you just see what a full, rich life, and they want to be buried at the St. Regis Church. And but some people might not pay attention when I hear the church part, and I see what a long life that they've had, and they seem like they were just good members of the community. And I just I don't think that happens by accident. I think that's kind of like how our family was. I think that's an undercurrent, of that structure or following that light. I just think that we have to be patient. We just can't look at everything in an all one-sided way, because I think it can be harmful, and it doesn't give the true picture. I think some things have to be on a different time frame.
Yeah. Earl, we have to leave it there, but thank you so much for sharing a little bit about you and who you are and what you do and your experience. I think it's an experience that a lot of people don't expect from Indigenous people, certainly what we've been hearing lately. So thank you for sharing a little bit of your story with us today. And thank you for your friendship. And I'm sure you and I will continue these conversations over the next months, but thank you for the little bit you've shared today.
Yeah, well, thank you for having me, Deacon Pedro. It was a pleasure.
Earl reminded me that there have been Indigenous Catholics for many generations, certainly since St. Caterina Tekakwitha lived in the 17th century. Many Indigenous people have grown up in the church and have no problem integrating their Indigenous identity and spirituality with their Catholic faith. Again, Earl highlights the importance of education, but also about being able to open up and be honest, not just with each other, but with ourselves, being able to face our anger, our sadness, our pain, and our vulnerabilities. To learn more about all Indigenous issues, especially as they intersect with the Catholic Church, you can visit our website, slmedia.org/healing-reconciliation-journey. To listen to all our Salt and Light Hour programs, and especially to other Indigenous Voices episodes, visit us at slmedia.org/podcast. I'm Deacon Pedro. Thank you for listening to this special Indigenous Voices edition of the Salt and Light Hour.